It's live.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Textual Healing Part 2. And I am the techno idiot who's just caused the delay. Richard was swearing at me and being nasty. So you'll either be watching this on Readers of the Lost Art or Richard's Philosophy channel. Well, welcome to everyone. And we thought we'd, there's a time lag, Richard. Can you hear that? I can hear my own voice coming back at me. Just to add to the fun.
It's echoing back, is it?
Yeah.
I can't hear nothing now because you're muted.
Yeah, I
so you'll get no time
to see whether. I'm just wondering whether it's using two mics.
You can't be getting feedback. You can't be getting feedback from your speakers because it's covered.
Oh God! Isn't this fun and games, everyone?
The only thing you can do is to try and turn down the input on your mic. Are you using a laptop? Sorry, everyone.
Yeah, I could just go. Shall I just try the MacBook microphone and tell me whether the sound's useless or not?
Yeah, sound. Try that.
Is that? That's just the MacBook.
It's actually not a bad sound. As long as it's not torturing you, then you're okay.
But I'm hearing it again. I think I've somehow entered twice. This is just.
Are there two pictures of you in the bottom left-hand corner?
No, just the one. Everything should be absolutely normal, but I'm just hearing myself. And there's a sound time delay. Everything I'm saying is in real time, and then there's 5 seconds and it comes back. I'm hearing it again.
Do you have the YouTube Live tab open somewhere?
Yes.
That's what's doing it.
Right, I've got rid of it, I think. There you go.
Be fine now.
Oh. But you know what is funny? That every time I tell you I'm an absolute techno idiot, you never fully believe how stupid I am.
Well,
and then we have these instances.
This is only from. I mean, I've been using StreamYard and doing online stuff for years, so you learn all of the pitfalls, and you think you've got it sorted. But then I wanted to use I've got a new funky mic just for today's special thing. And as soon as you plug in a new piece of technology, everything is like, oh, we've got to update this and change that. And what? I'm like, please don't try and improve anything. Just be the same shit thing you always.
Anyway, can I now show Kafka-esque levels of self-loathing to everybody in the chat?
This is actually a very good way to start with self-loathing and self-recrimination.
Yeah, Chad in the chat just said now he can't see me, and that is about to give me a brain aneurysm. Anyway, I'll try that again, everyone. Thanks for your patience. It was all completely my fault. I made 2 or 3 technical errors. So the idea was every month we'd look at something in depth, a work of literature. So I asked about 2 or 3 years ago, I think, Richard, I asked you to read Metamorphosis. And your original impression, I think, I don't want to misrepresent you. Did you say that you didn't enjoy it? You found it interesting, but you didn't enjoy it.
I didn't like being in his world. It was uncomfortable, very uncomfortable being there, was what I told you a couple of years ago.
Yeah, and having reread it, are you more amenable to the story or just still not like it?
I'm more amenable to the story. I think I managed to start taking on the nastiness using the blood meridian filter of sort of saying, okay, the nastiness is purposeful. Like, you're supposed to feel claustrophobic. You're supposed to be repulsed. Okay, now why? And that's the interesting part. It's like, why does the author want me to be uncomfortable? Okay, why? Let's assume there's purpose to this, and let's analyze the purpose. I read it the first time around as a brainless consumer.
But I mean, I'm interested, and it's my ongoing therapy with you that I've never paid you for, because I can back up what I'm about to say, because there are funny bits in it. And one thing I'd suggest right from the get-go is, have you ever seen Vertigo? I'd be interested in how many people viewing this have seen Hitchcock's Vertigo.
Not from beginning to end, no.
Well, I'll just ruin it for everyone from the get-go, because at the very beginning, the protagonist is hanging from a gutter on a very high roof. And then you don't see him being rescued, and the rest of the film takes place. And I would strongly argue that there's a very good narrative argument to say that he's imagined everything because he's about to fall to his death.
Right.
So there's a question of everything that's being described, did it actually happen? And that's how I approach Metamorphosis, because I can give you examples within the text of where, so right from the get-go, for example, he says he's turned into a bug, but he's not alarmed by it. He's quite laid back about it. Later, not far into the story, he basically says, I'm going to go in and see how my family respond. And depending on that, I think there's a line where he says, I still aim to get the 8 o'clock train. If he genuinely was this oversized bug, how would he ever expect to get to the train station?
Yes, I looked, I wanted to see if there was like a psychoanalytic angle on this. And one of the things that kept on coming up was a German word that I now can't remember that's it means uncanny. And it has the unheimlich, the uncanny logic of a dream. And I did a long drive the other day from London to Liverpool, and I started thinking about magical realism, Colombian literature of magical realism, and I've not read any magical realism for years. And then there's that Cormac McCarthy element where actually, no, you could argue that there is magical realism in books, in all of Cormac's books. Things happen that are a given, but that don't strictly make sense by the rules of the reality that we live in. They could only exist in a reality that still has rules, but not these rules. And that, I think, is a great way of capturing the dream state, which, if you're trying to capture the dream state as an author and bring a reader into it, I think it's implicit that these things are unconscious. They're not really. It's not literally. He's not literally a bug. Literally.
And you see, I think I might go even further though, and I would say he's flitting in and out of it. So, for example, the whole thing could be a dream, and he never actually has woken up. He's just lying in bed, and it's massive wish fulfillment how he'd like to get out of his job, and he'd like to have a better relationship with his family. I'd argue that's one possibility. I'd argue there's another possibility that every single representation of him as a bug is his psyche working through his distaste and the things that are going wrong in his family and his dislike of his job and all of these things. And he's flitting in and out of interacting in reality as a human being and imagining that he's been overtaken by this psychic imagining of his own loathsomeness.
Yes.
So my guess is that most readers always seem to think, right, this is the real bit. This is the metaphorical bit. And I would argue that maybe, to let you do your Zizek impression, maybe it's neither. Maybe it's actually, what if that actually it's just an exploration of his inner neurosis?
That this time round of reading it, because you said, obviously I was like, oh, I've already read it, and then you said to me, just have a reread of it, and I was like, okay, I'll give it another go. I was reading it with different eyes, so I would say, to further your idea, it reads like a young man who's highly sensitive, highly neurotic, probably has complex post-traumatic stress, who in a poetic way is trying to describe alienation, feeling internally fractured and not feeling part of a cohesive tribe, and then struggling with the judgment of others. He feels the weight of the expectation of culture, of society, of his the ever looming father in Kafka's stories, and he's failing. And I just literally now went through one of the earlier chapters where he's stuck in his room and the voices are coming through the door. And it's the voice of his sister who he loves. And it's the voice of his mother who's so upset. She's so upset. And then the father is furious. He says, stop upsetting your mother. And even his boss comes and gives him this dressing down. You are an irresponsible young man. I'm disgusted. You would put this to your parents, you would do this to. And it's all through the wall.
Yeah, that's brilliant. But sorry to interrupt, because you just mentioned the head clerk comes to visit the house.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if this was, and that this is the inverted commas real aspect of what's going on. So this is reality, inverted commas, intruding into the scene where he thinks he's a bug. What are the chances? He also mentions that he's worked, he hasn't taken a day off in 5 years. What are the chances that the head clerk would come to the house on the first day within hours of him not making the train? It's not going to happen, which is evidence that it's his paranoia. He's in a paranoid mindset.
Yes, and because largely the voices are coming through the wall. Sorry to hammer the psychoanalytic theory thing, but if I'm here for anything, it's that. If I could contribute anything, it's that. These are introjects. They're not real. It's the introject of the chief clerk who represents society at large, and then it's the introject of his father. It's the introject of his mother. It's the introject of his sweet sister, who he has a good but this is like pre-Melanie Klein object relations theory, not by much, but like only by 20, 30 years. But how it's genius what he's describing. And just very brave, very, very courageous. Especially if you think about the time he was living in, it's very brave.
Well, just to back up what you're saying, he'd read, I know for a fact, reading his diaries, he'd read in a reading group Freud. I think the book that they'd read was The Psychopathology of Everyday Life, which was around about 1902, 1903. That was published. And I think Kafka and his friends read it afterwards. But interestingly, this story was written 1912. And the ego stuff that Freud published wasn't until the 1920s. So I'm backing up exactly what you're saying. He had read some Freud, but he then actually developed ideas in fiction that are more Freud than Freud in a certain way. He was ahead of the curve in some of his psychological insights.
Absolutely. And so the experience of rereading it was like, okay, it's psychological insight, but it's also he's obviously a very highly sensitive chap and probably an introvert. So for him to then expose it and put it out there with him as in the first person, he's Prague, isn't he? He's Czech Republic, 1902. I think he would have been speaking German, not Czech, if I've got that right.
No, well, he was a ethnic German in the new Czechoslovakia. It was the Austro-Habsburg Empire, wasn't it? He's in the old Czech kingdom, and his parents, and obviously he was from a Jewish background. They were twice the outsider, because they were German speaking. They also spoke Czech, but German was their first language. But they're also Jewish. And this is of a time, I think the Emancipation Act for Jewish people in that area was around about 1861, 62. And Kafka's grandfather had to apply for permission to get married from the government, because there was a quota. So only so many Jewish people from the ghettos were allowed to marry at any one time. There was a one dead, one back in type of arrangement. So that's the social background. And I think that feeds into the idea that the self-loathing. Someone asked me in my channel about to what extent did he figure the rise of the totalitarian societies. and to what extent did he foresee the rise of the Nazis? And that's an interesting aspect, because I think the story works at so many levels. There's the social level. He's a Jewish outsider, and he's a double outside because he's a German Jew, ethnic German Jew in the Czech, what do they call it then? The Bohemia.
I don't know if that's the right era. There'll be a history buff here. The Bohemia might have been before. I don't know. I thought.
Well, let's just keep calling it.
I don't want to expose my ignorance.
If we can call it Czechoslovakia, just for our purposes, knowing that it's had a complex history. So you've got this. This is why I think it's such a brilliant story, because it works at the social level. And I'm not claiming that Kafka was deliberately writing from a social element. Obviously, he was aware of anti-Semitism, though the Zionist movement was beginning all around him. But at the same time, you can't help but think it was incredibly prescient, given that his three sisters ended up in the death camps. So he's in this atmosphere where there had been pogroms across Europe for decades and centuries. So there's always that tinderbox atmosphere. He's also writing about a bureaucratic society. He worked in a bureaucratic office for workers' accidents insurance, and apparently he was very good at his job. And I've seen one description of him as an anarcho-conformist, because by day he was like some Superman. By day he was this unassuming Hong Kong Phooey lawyer, workers' accident person, and at night he basically stayed up all through the night and went without sleep so that he could indulge his writing. So you've got all these levels where he's interacting with the society around him, but he's also writing about his own personal self-loathing, the way he didn't fit into his own family. You've then got the social thing, so it's called Metamorphosis, and it's about transformation. But the society within which he's writing, he's a contemporary of Proust. And if you think of those writers, they lived through the rise of photography, the early days of cinema, the emergence of the motor car, air travel, all these things, the telephone. We think we've lived through quite frenetic metamorphosis type times. He was absorbing all of this and filtering it through his own self-loathing. So I think it just works at so many levels.
Yes, and the part of what I was reading as well, maybe at a more microcosmic level, is maybe this is the story of all young men struggling to break through into manhood. I don't want to over Freudian it, but I was like, the guy's in his room failing his family. At one point he tries to turn with his beetle insect mouth a key in a lock, and he presses his mandibles too hard because he can't control them, and gore drips down onto the floor. And I was thinking, is that him in his room just frenetically, neurotically jerking himself stupid and hating himself for it, staining himself, do you know, there was this physical. I didn't notice the first time around how physical it is in what is presumably a very, it's going to be a very you wouldn't talk, I wouldn't think about that type of thing, being gory, being graphic. There was another story that you had me read, which we're going to discuss later, but it's not gory. But at one point, the father raises his nightgown and he's showing what a slut this man's potential fiancée is. Oh, she's a slut. She did this for you. He's obviously naked underneath, because he's already described removing his father's underwear. And you think, this is probably by the time it's quite physical, more physical than I would expect for writing at that time. So I did wonder, is it a little bit the story of a neurotic, highly sensitive young man who's really struggling to find his place in the world, and it's driving him mad. It's driving him a little bit psychotic.
I think you need to stop apologizing for the Freudian element, because it reeks of Freudian interpretations. And the story, I think, tell me whether I'm wrong that you're referring to that. I also asked you to read, and I asked the people on my channel, The Judgment.
Yes.
Just for those who haven't read it, it's a very short story. I'll put the link in the description to this video. But The Judgment is a weird story where there's a son, his father lives at home, the father's recently widowed, and he's got a friend in St. Petersburg, and the son is about to get engaged. He hasn't told his friend in St. Petersburg. He eventually tells his father. His father reacts negatively and basically says, go and kill yourself. And at the very end of the story, plot spoiler, he jumps into a river and kills himself. And that story, I'd suggest, when you read it through, it's very odd and it's very difficult to make sense of it. But actually, if you think of the friend in St. Petersburg as the id, going off and doing what he wants and not being under parental control, if you think of the son as the ego, and if you think of the father as the superego, those three Freudian terms not completely, but provide an incredibly useful key for understanding what's going on. And I would suggest in that story, again, that the friend in St. Petersburg doesn't actually exist. What Kafka is describing is the Freudian ego, id, superego model in fictional form. And that's why I think it's absolutely brilliant. And to lean into, because I know I don't have to give you an excuse to be crude, but I would now accuse you, my judgment on you, you will have to go and jump in the nearest river, is that you've not been crude enough. Because there was a short story that it actually wasn't even a short story, it was a fragment, because Kafka was very bad at finishing anything. I think it was called Preparations for a Wedding in the Country. And I think the protagonist is called Raban. And he imagines being able to send his fully clothed self off into this country wedding while he could stay in bed. And the beetle he describes himself is called, don't start. The beetle is called a cockchafer. You couldn't.
This is an intelligent conversation only for adults.
No. And what's interesting about, so it's a particular type of beetle. And I think it was 1911. So remember, the Metamorphosis was written in 1912, but in 1911, there was an epidemic of cockchafers on the European mainland, and farms were losing their crops. So just to add a bit of linguistic embellishment to your idea that he was a rabid onanist, there are these quite funny links that can be made.
That's really, I've never heard of a cockchafer before. Yeah, I mean,
you have, just in a different context.
In a different context, yes. And Kafka probably was a bit of a cockchafer. That's very much how it read this time around. A guy in his room who's lazy, doesn't want to face up to his responsibilities, doesn't really want to leave his room, feels enormously guilty for staying in his room and wanking all the time, and is only aware of his family's movements through the sounds through the wall. And there was something this time around that really stuck with me, that the sense of self-loathing. Last time I only got the claustrophobia. I only could receive the claustrophobia.
Could we dwell on that issue of sounds? Because I didn't ignore it, but I overlooked it when you mentioned it last time, because I think it's actually key. In cinema studies, they refer to the acousmatic, which is this notion of a voice that doesn't really seem to have an origin. And one of my favorite examples, I'm a Hitchcock, talk about cockchafers, but I'm a Hitchcockian obsessive. And in Rear Window, there's a incident where there's a newlywed couple, and you see them, they're being voyeuristically looked at by the protagonist. And the bride is carried over the threshold into this apartment. And then the curtains are drawn, and he makes a dirty joke about, or an innuendo about what they're up to. Halfway through the film, you see him hanging out the window in a vest, and you hear this voice. I think his name's Harry. Just go, Harry, Harry, and he's still on his honeymoon, and he has this look on his face. Oh my God, I've got to go back in and do my duty. But it's the voice. It's this acousmatic voice, and it reminded me of the voice of the mother at the very beginning, Gregor, and then the daughter. and then the father quietly and then later bangs the door with his fist. But these voices, and what made me, when you mentioned the sound issue, the acousmatic nature of these voices, in reality, and this is something else about, I often don't like reading too much into the actual life situation of an author that may have affected their writing. But Kafka lived in a room very similar to that described in Metamorphosis. And it was basically an in-between room where there were all these doors. It was like he was like sleeping in the living room in this big apartment that all the family lived in. So he felt, and he was always looking for quiet to write. That's why he had to write in the middle of the night. And in those days, people lived on top of each other much more than today. So these acousmatic voices, they're a representation of what he must have been going through on a very practical level. Absolutely cheesed off with this claustrophobic nature of his own family, which then again is a metaphor for isn't everyone, isn't that the nature of family? And sometimes the more your family loves you, the more claustrophobic it is.
Yes. Yes. There's a practical thing there. If people are interested, if they go to Prague and rent an Airbnb, provided they check the Airbnb first, you can rent apartments that really haven't changed in 150 years. That nothing has changed. They're very, very, very old, and the walls are very, very, very thin. They have obviously they have a unique feeling. I've stayed in apartments like that. The narrow staircases where things like you can hear everything. Apartments above, apartments below, everything. You can hear everything, which is an invasion. And I suppose in many ways, a family unit, whether they're abusive or loving, as you just said, yeah, there is an oppression there because expectation is put on you. And if you're a highly sensitive person and a bit neurotic, to use the old-fashioned psychology term, as Kafka clearly is, high IQ, very sensitive, bit neurotic, it would be torturous. So just normal for what for his peers would have just been normal life, and they just wouldn't have even thought twice about it. Probably was quite torturous for him.
What I found interesting about that was on my channel, I did a video all about Letter to His Father, which was a long, just for those who aren't familiar with it, it was a long letter he hand wrote, and I think he typed up the last 2 pages, and he gave it to his mother to give to his father, and it was basically accusing his father of having ruined his life. But when you actually read the letter, the accusations are relatively mild. Or from my experience, I honestly, my initial experience was he sounds like quite a funny, nice dad, and you're just a bit of a wimp. Grow up. And I got a bit of pushback, and I understand it. We all come to these things with our own experiences, but I was quite surprised because I saw what he was writing about in Letter to His Father and what he writes about in Metamorphosis. The underlying neurotic elements that you're talking about are actually what is pervasive in our society today. Kafka was able to channel that neurosis into writing. So on the one hand, I'm quite judgmental. I think as a person, he was quite pitiful and pathetic and self-wheedlingly indulgent. But I don't begrudge him that, because my God, if that's what you need to be to write the literature he did, brilliant. The problem is we've got that level of neurosis in society at large without the creative outlet to sublimate it.
Yes, yeah, there is something to that. If I'm sure life was very, very hard and unpleasant, but if that kind of pressure and torture produces diamonds like that, it's great for us. Wasn't great for Kafka. I do wonder, as like what you've just said about Kafka, you know, the critique of him as being wretched and wheedling. I think he was high IQ enough to know that. I think he knew he was wretched. I think he was self-aware enough to know that he was wretched. And I think it goes, I won't overstretch too far. It's just conjecture. It was physical. Like he was a physically small and weak man. And I wonder if this story, the Metamorphosis, is almost a description of this is what I am. I can't change what I am. You want me to be a traveling salesman who's constantly performing and being an exhibitionist and being a merchant and making money out in the world, but the thing I am is not that. And you are hurting me with this pressure. But he can't complain to anyone because who the fuck's going to listen to him in Prague in 1905? They're like, shut up, lad, go to work. Life sucks. Get on with it. And so the only person he can complain to is the writing.
One of the elements that I think is frustrating probably for both of us is neither of us speaks any German.
Yeah.
So we're losing the language element, but I am aware I'm going to do at least 2 videos on my channel, just doing a fine tooth comb analysis of the whole story. So we may talk about it in quite general terms, but I'm going to go right down into the story. But one of the very end, if you remember the very end of the Judgment story, I think as he jumps off the bridge, there's the line, and the traffic continued over the bridge. There's a line something like that.
Yeah, no, it's fuck. Yes, it is like that. There was a surge of traffic that covers the noise. No one's going to hear him. No one's going to see him. The surge of traffic will cover the fact that he's just.
But what's interesting is,
yeah,
I will research this properly, but from memory, from my initial research, the word traffic can have a sexual connotation, like intercourse. So you've mentioned the fact he was a traveling salesman and he was engaged in business intercourse. I think there's a German word that refers to it's ambiguous. It can refer to trading and business. It does have a sexual connotation as well.
It does in English, trafficking.
Yeah. Probably what I'm saying is more so in German, the ambiguity is clearer. So to build on what you're saying, this self-loathing, in his letter to his father, it's clear that his father was this big strapping butcher's son who pulled a cart through the mud of, Middle Europe, and when he went swimming was this big bull of a man. Kafka was the exact opposite, and you have to add to that, in Middle Europe at the time, there was this stereotypical idea that Jewish men were effeminate. Being Jewish was associated with effeminacy. And then you can add to that, none of these things have been proved. And normally I wouldn't speculate, because why does it matter? But I think in this instance, it does matter. There's a potential likelihood that he himself was either gay or had very confused sexuality. So at the very beginning of the story, there's remember the photograph, the magazine, he's cut something out of a magazine, and it's a picture of Venus in Furs, which was a novel written by Saka Masok, the guy from which we get the term masochism. Venus in Furs is a novel all about masochism, and the main character, I think his name's Severin, but he's given, as he has this submissive relationship with Venus, he's called Gregor.
Oh.
So Kafka's taken the name, he's taken the picture and referred to it from the get-go. And at one point, when he's this disgusting bug and his sister and mother are removing all of the furniture, the beetle that now is Gregor presses himself against the glass of the picture. It's the one thing in the room, and he gets stuck to the picture in some type of weird coital act.
So you're right. I'm never going to apologize for this being Freudian again. there's no other way to read that. There's literally no other way to read that.
And I haven't even started, because do you remember how the picture is described? No. It's a woman who's got her hands. Again, I'm going to set you off. I know I am. She's got a very large muff. That's how it's described, a big fur muff.
But are you talking about a merkin? Are you talking about a pubic wig, or are you talking about...
but this is the ambiguity of the term.
I see.
What it looks like.
I see.
The fur is I hate saying fur as someone from Liverpool. That's not fair.
That's not fair, though.
The fur... And everyone listening is like, is he saying F-A-I-R or F-U-R? No one knows.
The fur.
But again, in Kafka, there's a whole list of animal stories that he wrote, and fur is a notion of animalism. It's primordial, it's our instincts. So that imagery, and it's also sexual, the whole idea of this big fairy object in the middle of this picture of a very attractive woman. And then just while it's in the back of my head, you mentioned the grossness of the physicality. At one level, it's almost like a throwaway line, but Gregor's mother is sewing underwear to make a living as a seamstress. She's basically sewing fancy underwear. So there's all these sexual allusions at various levels.
In the judgment, he comments on his father's underwear and says, "Oh, it doesn't look clean. I don't think I've been looking after him properly." I read that and I just went, "What? Why are you saying that?" So is this what is that then? Is this an
well, I'd suggest that
confession of incestuous desires?
No. I think you're overreading that one. I think that's about washing your dirty linen in public.
Okay.
That's what that made me. I'm not saying I'm right, but that's what that made me think about. But you're right. He's also seeing his father's genitalia, which most people don't want to see. But he's doing it, and when that happens, he lifts. This is, by the way, everyone, that we're talking about the story, the judgment now. He lifts his father up, and his father is toying. Is it with a watch chain?
A watch chain. He starts diddling with the watch. So the man is lifting, the young man, the son is lifting his father and placing him to the bed. And as he does that, the father, which is really creepy, starts to diddle with his watch and chain and won't let go of it.
But I interpreted that as what that's about is the way in which it happens to us all. Your parents regress, you become the parent, they become the child. And then what's very disorientating is shortly after that's happened, the father could not be more childlike. He then stands up in bed and asserts his authority. And I just think that's Kafka, and there's elements of that in the Metamorphosis. This relationship to your father and your mother is both, when the story opens and the initial descriptions, Gregor is the main breadwinner. And he talks about paying off the debts of his parents. And again, this is the language thing. Debt in German is Schuld. And debt also means guilt.
Oh.
So he's paying off his father and mother, their debt. But there's also this, always with Kafka, this very basic notion of guilt. He's living in original sin. Kafka, this is how he's been described as a writer. Kafka writes about people who are born in original sin and never escape it. And they never know what they're being charged with because they're guilty from the get-go.
The guilt of, it's the guilt of existence, the de facto guilt of existence, isn't it?
And if anyone wants to accuse me, if anyone wants to accuse me of making this up, it's interesting that towards just before he died, Kafka was reading Kierkegaard, Either Or, and he'd read it many years earlier and didn't like it. But it was the book he chose. I think he was in a sanitarium towards the end. The book he was reading right towards the end was Kierkegaard. And Kierkegaard was obsessed about this notion of we're born in original sin. But original sin is necessary because original sin for Kierkegaard was linked with this idea. Sin is inextricably linked with the fact that as human beings, we make choices. Animals don't sin because what choices, conscious choices do they have? They're instinctual. What the very thing that makes us human is this ability to choose. And it's what makes human life worthwhile, but it's what makes human life so lending itself to neurosis, because we never know whether the choices we've made are good ones or bad ones.
That was always my reading of the Adam and Eve fable, is that they went from being sinless animals, and then through experience they gain knowledge. Then they distinguish between right and wrong, and then you can sin. Before that, you literally can't sin because you don't know what you're doing, which is interesting because that links back to the fact his father throws apples at him when he's a bug. And I was thinking, why apples? And now you've just closed that mental loop for me. It's
And
the beginning of sin.
someone's being a bit arsy in the comments saying original sin is bullshit. I'm not trying to understand, and this is one of the things that frustrates me. It doesn't matter whether you think the Old Testament is a comic. It really doesn't matter, because Kafka was an educated man. And this is what I wanted also to talk to you about. Authors of that time use concepts like original sin. Philosophers use that concept. You can strip out its religious connotations. And this is one of the things I wanted to lead on to, the extent to which Kafka, he's a weird writer, because I'd argue he's a religiously atheist writer. He's writing about a world in which God doesn't exist. But in all of his work, there is a God-sized hole.
Yes, he's too high IQ for an anthropomorphized daddy god, but he's still craving for, I don't know, like you say, the God-sized hole that all of humanity craves to have filled.
Well, it goes back to what I was saying before about why I think his neuroticism is interesting. Is he was, as you'll keep pointing out, high IQ enough to be reflecting upon issues like original sin, what happens in a world without a God, where do you get your meaning from? All of these things he's implicitly relating to. And these are the things that don't happen in our society today, because we have the godlessness. And this isn't me being religious for the slower ones in the chat. This is about what factually happens in a world when there are no traditional sources of meaning that are underwritten by socially accepted values.
Yeah.
So Kafka was beginning to see the breakdown of Nietzsche. Kafka read a lot of Nietzsche, apparently. And Nietzsche was obviously one of the best encapsulators of a world without God. God is dead. And Kafka's writing in that tradition. And I just find what's happened today is, just to go back to your point, you kept saying he's a high IQ, and he's high IQ enough to reflect upon it. In the Metamorphosis, you mentioned the sounds to try and draw all this together. You mentioned the sounds, and I talked about the acousmatic nature of it. It's interesting that Kafka wanted to play down the visuality of the Metamorphosis. So on the first edition of the book, there is a man coming out of a doorway, and the doorway is dark and foreboding, and he's clutching his head a bit like Edvard Munch's The Scream. And Kafka demanded that they didn't portray the bug. They wanted to put the bug on the cover. And also the very beginning of is it Ungeheuer and Ungeziefer is the monstrous vermin. That's what he's described as. The word vermin, Ungeziefer, there's an which is the negative part, the prefix. It means an animal not suitable for sacrifice, that type of vermin. So in the old Jewish meaning of it was it's the type of animal that you couldn't sacrifice in the temple.
It's too dirty even to be sacrificed.
And there are obvious, the way it's described, everyone has assumed it's a cockchafer, cockroach type of thing. But Kafka was very careful to leave it quite vague. And to go back to my point about, is he imagining all of this? At one point, he decides whether I go to catch the train or not will depend how my family respond to me. So he's going out into the living room, and this happens 3 times. And if I forget, please remind me of the importance of the number 3. But he goes in to see the family, and he has to retreat 3 times. And there is one line, I'm sorry to keep going on about it, but there's one line where he says, depending on how my family respond, I will catch the 8 o'clock train. So I would think this self-loathing, it's literalized in a metaphor, if that's not a contradiction in terms, as a cockroach. But it's much more likely he had the self-loathing about his body. He'd imbibed this general antipathy towards weak, effeminate Jewish men from society at large. And there's the potential he was either gay or deviant. I'm not saying being gay is deviant, I'm saying of the standard of the times. So that the incestuous hints towards his sister, the reflection when the mother runs to the father, her petticoats fall one by one before she hugs the father. So that's almost like an Oedipal jealousy syndrome going on. There's all this weird, I mentioned the Venus and furs from the picture. There are a lot of strange sexual references that could be about his self-loathing and how he thought his family viewed him, both as and in reality, he wasn't a breadwinner. He made decent money, but he lived at home and his father was the successful businessman. So that's not true. He's actually in the story reversed the truth. But I don't know what you think about this idea that I do think it's his own self-loathing, whether that's sexual or just generalized neuroticism. I do think it fuels an awful lot of the story.
Yeah, this thing about as a bug pressing himself up against the image I would have taken that as a tacit confession of maybe even a porn addiction. I mean, porn didn't exist then as it does now, but it did exist. It definitely existed. Because a couple of weeks ago, I got into there was a scandal with Freud. I won't bore everybody with it, but he originally patients would come to him with stories of childhood sexual abuse, and he believed them. And then at one point, he flipped the script and said, "No, this is projection. This is fantasy, because surely not all of these good men of Vienna would all be. There'd be too many good Viennese Catholic men abusing their sons and daughters sexually, and that's not possible." So I went into it and I was like, how Catholic was it? How much prostitution was there? And how much pornography was there? And there was plenty. Obviously, Vienna isn't Prague, but it's Middle Europe. It's probably all going on. So it's Zizek's fetishist split. We certainly don't do that. Meanwhile, there's a ton of energy being exerted on exactly that thing that you've denied. But it's not. The only sexual reference then to a person is to the mother slightly, to the final lines about the sister, which are very odd. And then the rest is focused on not a woman, but an image of a woman. And that then feeds back into this kind of this horrible sense of alienation and a human fractured from himself who can't find a place in the world. And the glass barrier is there between what he really wants and what he really wants doesn't even exist. It's just a photo. It's and he only connects with it in his insect body.
Yeah, and this thing about social interaction, and Darren gave me a message earlier on about is it called reaction formation? You'll know.
Freud, yeah.
The way in which you respond and you over respond dependent upon the context and the people, how they're reacting towards you. And I think we've talked briefly, but of the time, Prague was a very claustrophobic space. I don't know whether I imagine this, but I spent a little bit of time in Olomouc in the east of the Czech Republic. And I'm sure I remember someone telling me, because it's landlocked, certain times of the year, the air pressure can be stifling and, the air doesn't move. And because if you live in Britain, it's constant wind everywhere. And you feel, even in the middle of England, you're only about 50 miles from the sea quite often.
Yeah.
And, you and I both come from an area that's right next to the sea. But you didn't have that. You had the claustrophobia that Kafka's writing about was actually borne out in the social atmosphere. And your point about this, I think you implied repression. It's like the Victorian thing, isn't it? They would cover up piano legs in dining rooms because they were too overtly sexual. Meanwhile, the paterfamilias is having sex with 13-year-old prostitutes.
Yeah.
And these things were known but not spoken about and coincided together.
Yes.
And Kafka went to prostitutes. This is well established. And Felice Bauer, his main fiance, because he had two, he was engaged to her twice. The way he describes her in one of his diaries is underwhelming. I think, for example, she had awful teeth, but he didn't actually find her attractive. The way he first describes her is that she meets this perfect wife that would be acceptable in that society at that time. In other words,
Mm.
basically a beard.
That's really interesting, and that, you know, it makes me think of, again, the human being in pain, just trying to find a way to turn societal pressure off, because for genetic or trauma-based reasons, he finds societal pressure unbearable. He finds all forms of pressure and obligation torturous, because he constantly feels like he's not fulfilling it. So yes, to take a woman on he didn't find attractive, just to stop the crazy voices in his head, and possibly the crazy voices of people in reality around him, it says a lot. That says a lot.
But then you see, it's even more complicated than that, and this is what I like, the layer upon layer of complexity, because he had a Julie, I think was his Julie. He had a second fiance that went nowhere. So then you might think, well, this is a repeated trend. But then he spent his final years living with a woman called Dora, who spoke highly of him. I think she ended up in one of the death camps, but she spoke very highly of him. And as far as I know, it sounded like a pretty normal physical relationship. So he seems to have been on the edge or confused, to say the least. But it's not. It's the ambiguity. I don't think it's enough, and it's not that interesting to, oh, he was gay and he couldn't handle the repression. I think that was an element, but it was more complicated than that. It was linked to the things you identified about. He didn't like his own body. He didn't like his own role within his own family. He thought he was married to his art. That was his real vocation. So he had this repressed anger about having to go to work. All these things feeding into themselves.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I think it's a mistake to just go, oh, it's repressed homosexuality. That might have been more bearable, because then he would have had a sexual identity. We discussed this on the Jolly Heretic twice, and Ed gave me a really good answer the second time round, where he said all sexual paraphilias are positively correlated with stress. So whether the stress is external trauma or internal, it doesn't matter. The more stressed a person is, the more hypersexual they become. And I do think there is a type of sexuality for people who are very, very stressed, very, very sensitive, that was depicted in that bloody awful series that we all had to watch for research purposes, Baby Reindeer. The main character, Richard, who seems to be struggling with latent homosexuality, seems to be struggling, but he's just hypersexual. And I think it's stress. So he wants to do the most exciting thing for him to do is what you are not supposed to do. And I think this is just pure conjecture on my part. I think that's another type of sexuality. It's just that we haven't, we as psychology hasn't caught up with it yet. There's people who are only turned on if it is wrong. So if being gay is wrong, that's the hottest thing you can do. If being this is wrong, that's the hottest. They want the boundary break, because the superego injunctions are so strong. The script payoff of doing the terrible thing, whatever it is look at you. Look at how disgusting you are. You're an insect glued to a porn picture.
But that would be true in his time, because I'd argue the repressive features of society, and there's been a civilization-long relationship between repression and artistic creativity in the form of sublimation. And one of my main arguments about the parlous state of today's society is that sublimation's been lost. Once repression's gone and anything goes, where do you get this creative repression? So why I like to get back to the metamorphosis, this whole notion of transformation, the way I've been describing it, I'm convinced it's a very complicated metaphor that sometimes is meant, he's imagining to the nth degree what are the consequences if you were a beetle. But he lets the metaphor drift in and out of salience. It's not always important to the story. It actually, it becomes representative of the family relations more than it's important as a metaphor. And I think that's Kafka's genius. He was a master of ambiguous metaphor. And I'd argue to a wider extent, that is what art does. Art takes metaphor and explores it, drifts in and out of it, and keeps the tension. That's the word I'd emphasize, is tension. You don't know when the metaphor is holding, you don't know when the metaphor isn't. In Kafka's other work, God seems nearby, or the law, but it's also distant, but it's affecting your life and putting you on trial. It's the castle that's nearby, but you can't see it because the mist. When Gregor's in his room, there's a huge hospital outside his window, and he mentions you can't see it because of the mist at one point. And this is, it's so classic Kafka. There's these looming presences, whether it's an absent God, whether it's the law courts in the trial, whether it's the castle. And you've seen castles in Prague. When the mist comes down, you know they're there, but you can't see them. And that's, the metaphor is non-visual. It's all the acousmatic aspects you were speaking about earlier. So it's a non-visual metaphor that Kafka is exploring with incredible complexity. And my argument is, today, because people don't read, they struggle with metaphor. They struggle, like in the comments, you mentioned original sin of the Old Testament as a source for metaphors. And someone says that's bullshit. In the recent controversy, sorry to go off, but it actually really brought home to me, in the recent Charlie Kirk controversy, Stephen King, you know, the very popular author, he accused Charlie Kirk of saying that gay people deserve to be stoned, and then it was proved that he didn't say that. And Stephen King had to make a formal apology. Do you remember the guy called Terry Christian from the 80s in the UK?
Yes.
For non-UK viewers, he was a loudmouth. He was a Mancunian, wasn't he?
Manc, yeah.
He was a minor celebrity, but at one stage he was all over the TV screen. So he's basically a superannuated ex-celebrity. And he was on Twitter or X, whatever. And when all this came out that Charlie Kirk had never said it, his actual quote was, F what Charlie Kirk, what was it? Something like, what the F does it matter what Charlie Kirk said? That was the actual quote. Because he
from Terry Christian.
Yeah. What the F does it matter what he said? And this is, remember when I said to you very early on in one of our interviews, the blue-haired crazy people shouting, not discussing, shouting, not talking. Well, for all his faults, Kafka was a master of metaphor. He was searching for meaning. He wasn't reliant upon images. He was these complex, non-visual metaphors he was pursuing. He was asking people to fill in the gaps, use your own imagination. And that's not what happens today. It's the exact opposite.
Okay. So a couple of questions. Would it possibly be true to say that Kafka would have been horrified by them putting the what do you call that? The vulgar image of an insect on the cover, because he doesn't want that object identified. He wants the reader to focus on the emotional reactions of himself to his own body, and then from his family and from his society. He wants us to be exploring how others are seeing this thing, and then you have to sort of half make up what it is inside of your own head. That's the focus, right? It's other people's repulsion and condemnation. Would that be true to say?
Yeah, it's the having to do the legwork, not the legwork, the brain work, to mix metaphors appropriately enough. It's having to do the work, not having the plot given to you tied in a bow, not being given self-evident tautological images like Hollywood does. Having to actually invest something of yourself into trying to understand what the whole story is about. And that's why I think, go on.
Sorry. So I'm now tracking historically, because this isn't that long ago. So it's like 115 years ago or something like that. And I'm tracking historically. Do we have stories where people turn into insects? Yes, we have The Fly. It was done twice. Oh no, 3 times it's been done. The second time it was done in the 80s, you had these horrible, the body, like Cronenberg level body horror, disgusting hairs. It's Jeff Goldblum growing through his skin, and he looks in the mirror there as you were chopping one of your toes off, or whatever it is you do on a Tuesday night in Wales. And he tries cutting off, and then his skin is, and okay, that's horrible, and it's body horror, and cool, it's got its place. But did we move slowly then from I have to simulate what my thing is, so then you have 1,000 people read Metamorphosis and you end up with 1,000 different versions of the story, to Cronenberg style body horror. No shade on Cronenberg or The Fly, I think it's a good movie, but here it is. Here is he's become a fly. How do we know he's a fly? Well, he's got big eyes and fucking trumpet for a mouth. He's a fly. And it's vulgar. It's absolute. There it is. The thing itself. Oh, okay. That's actually not that frightening then. At some point that becomes ridiculous. The monster in the movie who's always in the shadows is far more terrifying than when you see it and it's got like 3 horns and fangs and you're like, it becomes comical. It becomes comical once you've lost the metaphor.
Well, what you're saying, it relates to one of the proudest moments of my life. When I was an undergrad student in Edinburgh, there was about 6 of us went to the cinema, and it was they did royal performances, premieres. It was a massive cinema, and there was a girl I knew was right in front of me. We were like 3 and 3. I was behind, and it was Alien. And it's honestly, it was about 1,500, 2,000 people, dark. The alien's about to come around the corner, or so you thought. And I like pressed their ribs. And it was the biggest blood-curdling scream you've ever heard from a human being, followed by 1,400 Scottish people laughing, which doesn't happen very often. And
but if they're gonna laugh at anything, the Scots will laugh at a blood-curdling scream.
But the point was Alien. The early films were genuinely terrifying, not when you saw the alien, although the thing coming out the stomach was quite impressive. But it was the promise or the threat of the alien. That is what bred the stress. Another example would be Blair Witch Project, the film.
Perfect example.
You don't see the thing you're terrified of the minute you see it. And to back all this up, the relevance to Kafka is there was a short story stroke fragment he wrote called Unhappiness, I think. And one of the characters is talking to the other one saying, I'm scared of ghosts. And he says, well, why don't you just grow up and stop being scared of ghosts? And I'm paraphrasing badly, but he says, it's not the ghosts themselves that scares me. It's what causes them. And the fear of that cause has never left me. I have it really bad. I thought that was psychologically very, very subtle.
Yeah.
It's not a white ghost wearing a sheet banging, a kitchen pan in the middle of the night. It's what's the energy force behind that actually is the ultimate cause. And that, I think that was a metaphor for Kafka's neurosis. It was that deep level.
I suppose it's what Kafka does successfully is he points at the corners of the human psyche where you have uncertainty, and it's quite hard. That, I suppose that's why the uncanny, what's the German for uncanny again?
Unheimlich.
It's a really good device to get people into that state of, is this real or is it not? And that's when the emotion or the terror or the strong response, that's when it opens up, is when it's uncanny. It could be real, but I'm not sure. Most Ouija board ceremonies at the time of Freud and Kafka, table tapping, somebody would do it fraudulently to get the people into the right emotional state until it stopped being fraudulent, until people actually unconsciously were moving things around or table knocking or speaking to the dead. You start with something fake, and then when people are in the psychological state of, is this real or is it not, that's when the potency opens. And we don't have that now because everything is literal. You're going to see the demon. You're going to see exactly what it looks like up close, because filmmakers seem to think that's the right thing to do.
We still have remnants of it though. So, for example, I really disliked, and it's an absolute shock to me. You know, Adolescence, that series.
Yeah, I hated it. Yeah.
It was truly awful. And just to cherry on the cake is the terrible child actor who was like a child version of Keanu Reeves. He was so wooden. Has just got an Emmy for Best Actor. So that just shows you what a debacle modern civilization has become. But anyway, I'm distracting myself. On Heimlich, my understanding in German means homely. So unheimlich is literally unhomely. And the way Freud described the uncanny, he said one of the essential components is that it seems familiar, yet somehow not right. So if it was just genuinely scary and out of the ordinary and extraordinary, that wouldn't be uncanny. And I think that's what you're describing. Hollywood and TV and the culture industry gives you scary special effects, all these things. The most effective dramas tend to be, and it's what Adolescence, that series, bad as it was, to the extent that it was successful, the uncanny element was, how can a seemingly innocent kid from a good family, without any of the normal psychological excuses, commit a murder? That's what was uncanny. And I think that's what dragged people in.
Yeah, well, and as a concept for a plot, it's actually really interesting. They just went, it was just too politically motivated. I think what ruined it was the clear political motivation behind it, which is why Hollywood is dying. It's absolutely dying on its fucking arse, and really, really struggling and slow. It's like the Titanic. They're trying to turn it, but it's turning very, very, very slowly, and they're realizing that they're like 20 years out of step to 30 years out of step with what audiences want. And people don't want to be lectured. I certainly don't want to be fucking lectured. And it's not like, I always sit there and I think, is the director and the producer respecting my intelligence as an audience member? And as soon as I feel my intelligence is being disrespected, I switch off, and you can't win me back as an audience member there. And I'm sat there going, do you think I'm so fucking dumb I can't recognize propaganda when I see it? Please be ambiguous. Please respect my intelligence. I'm not stupid. The other people in the cinema are not stupid. Let them have ambiguity and uncanny elements.
Yeah, and the aspect about I would also add to that, though, the concept of entertainment. So I think most people are very aware of how ideological a lot of mainstream media is. It's so obvious what the preordained script is. But I'm not sure as many people are aware of their need to be entertained. It's like Gladiator, are you not entertained? This is an aspect of human culture. So in Roman times, panem et circenses, bread and circuses. It's the lowest form of culture. It's always been our desire to be entertained. But when we initially discussed Metamorphosis a couple of years or so ago, you said, I think, you didn't enjoy it. And I remember my response was, it's like a Tina Turner song. What's enjoyment got to do with it?
Yeah.
I honestly, and I wasn't being pretentious, it didn't strike me. The idea that I would read a novel for enjoyment was alien to me.
I think we have that interview somewhere.
Yeah.
And so Paul's not making this up. He's literally indignant, and he's like, I didn't fucking ask you whether you enjoyed it. What the enjoy? Just read it.
I was personally offended that you thought I gave a toss whether you enjoyed it or not. That's what was funny.
A metric. That is not a metric by which we measure the validity of a piece of art. Enjoy it.
No, I was personally because I was offended because you seemed to think I was enough of an empathetic creature to give 2 Fs whether you enjoyed something or not. And I thought, he really doesn't. I know we hadn't known each other for long, but you really didn't know me if you thought I cared whether you enjoyed it.
No, I think there is there's a whole philosophy of reading, and there's a whole philosophy of taking on art that I think has a lot scope to it, which is, you know, your idea. Yes, it should be hard at times. Not all the time. I'll read a sci-fi book and drift off into another world for a minute. But yeah, some art should be hard because you should be exercising your brain. Some literature should be difficult. You should be exercising your brain the way you exercise your body or anything else.
But can I now be a provocative gear?
Mhm.
Because
Why
it just
change?
made me think, talking on from Adolescence, that horrible series.
Mm.
It's interesting that if you think about, and I think this is true of the States and the UK, so I don't think I'm making things up. This idea and the recent killing of Charlie Kirk, the love interest person was, am I correct in saying, a member of the furry community?
I'm
So
not sure.
the alleged
The
assassin's partner
yeah, allegedly,
was,
yes, I think so.
yeah, was a member of the furry community, and I think there's a photograph of some weird animal costume.
Mm.
Think how far we've descended as a society when Kafka's writing a book that's an incredibly complex, ambiguous metaphor. What are the psychological ramifications of waking up and feeling verminous? And I identify as an insect in an incredibly self-reflective way. He knows he's not an insect. We're now in a society where school children, rather than read Kafka and learn the complexity and psychological resonance of deep metaphors, are just told, whatever identity you say you have, we'll support you. And the difference, I that's how our society has undergone a metamorphosis. We're no longer capable of understanding the story Metamorphosis.
Okay, let me see if I can follow that up to your point. So if there's restriction, then there can be emancipation. If there's no restriction, there's no emancipation. If everything is allowed and you can do whatever you want, there actually is nothing to free yourself from. The person who complained before about the idea of original sin, yes, on face value, if you have a religion and you say to a bunch of children, you're all guilty of original sin and people should all feel guilty, that's crazy. But within that same ideology, there is redemption. Without original sin, there's no redemption. It doesn't, what you need redemption for? You're absolutely fine as you are. And I think that's what we're losing with this hyper permissive literalism, is there can be no, and I think this is what you've tried to allude to with the Greek tragedy a few times. There's no cleansing. There's no catharsis. You can't clean yourself of anything. You just take on more and more and more and more until, I don't know, you go psychotic.
And the psychosis to me is based upon, to go back to your notion about, you know, the voices that made an impression on you at the beginning of the story. The voices are coming in from all these different doors. Kafka does it quite a few times. He portrays what is it like to have a human mind inside an animal. So I, in a previous video, looked at his short story, The Burrow, where again, it's an ambiguous creature. It's most likely to be a badger type creature, but he never specifies. And the creature starts to hear noises. He's made this impregnable burrow. And so the metaphors are very psychological. We all create our own burrows so that we aren't threatened by external sources. But what if you've created such a safe burrow, you then began to imagine the threats from the outside? So that's one aspect, which I think links to what you've just said about it's this idea of when there's no repression, so the equivalent of that is when you have the safest burrow possible, you then have to invent your own paranoia.
Yes. The idea of a burrow, like an infinitely safe space, to use the modern term, a safe space, it almost encourages the paranoia of threat, in a sense, because how can a burrow be safe unless there's a threat? If there's no threats, it's not safe. It's just a fucking burrow. You need threats for it to be for it to qualify as a safe burrow. It needs to be not a dangerous one. So the predators are necessary. And that feeds into this idea of the mass psychosis and the delusion in modernity, where I think people are making threats up, or I know they are. I know that they're pretending that things are worse than they are. I know they're pretending that the world is more violent and full of more. It is violent and full of malice, but they're pretending it is more than it is, in order to maintain a sort of a strange, grandiose psychological stasis, in order for their identity to make sense.
Yeah, but it's more than stasis. I'd argue it's victimhood, and this is another aspect of Kafka. His letter to his father that people gave me pushback on because I was, typically unsympathetic. This turned himself into a verminous bug. There's like a Christ-like crucifixion element. He's nailed to the floor at one point, and there's you made the point, the apples are thrown into his back. Obvious reference to original sin in the Garden of Eden. But you need something to kick back against to get your own psychological development. And Kafka, again, was high IQ enough to realize this. So he's describing his own struggle. I almost said Mein Kampf, but that would be inappropriate. The spirit of Ed lives on. But this idea of the voice, I find interesting, because Kafka is describing what happens, and I would suggest that is the most disturbing element of the metamorphosis as it begins to happen. He's actually quite laid back about the fact he seems to have a different body. Getting out of bed as a beetle is actually, the way it's described, is quite funny. The really alienating metamorphosis is when he tries to speak to his family and he realizes his voice is no longer his own. So he doesn't have his own voice. And that, I would argue, is what's stressing the bejesus out of the younger generation. They don't have their own voice. But rather than strive and battle and struggle for it and explore it through complex metaphors, the notion of identity, rather than engage with the story as complex as the burrow, they go to school. They go to school and say, "Mum, Dad, I've decided to be a badger." It's the literalization of a metaphor has become the lingua franca of our society. It's bizarre.
On the last Jolly Heretic we did, I was going to make a point, and then we drifted off on something else. You taught me, who says le nom du père? Who's that?
Oh, Lacan.
Lacan, which
Jacques
means
Lacan.
that the name of the father, but the linguistic ambiguity between nom and non is the no of the father. And that stuck in my head for a long time. And I was having a conversation at Liverpool Podcast Studios with one of the editors yesterday, and I said, "Were you raised in an education system that was mainly women or mainly men?" And he said, "Oh, I've never thought about it, but it was mainly women." I said, "I was very privileged. I went to boarding school, and then after boarding school, I went to private school. I was raised by not just men, but angry men, very, very strict men." And he was like, "Oh, that must have been awful." And I was like, "It wasn't. It wasn't at all." When I was in board, this is a brief story for people. We all have to do homework as kids, and I didn't enjoy doing homework. When I was in boarding school, they sat us in a room for 2 hours where you could not talk. If you spoke, an angry man would yell at you, and you could get thrown out, and you would be shamed and whatever else. And you know what? You worked. You just, because there's fuck all else to do. So you worked, you studied. Once I was taken out of boarding school and I was at home, I was permitted to do what I wanted. I just went to my room and was a beetle like Kafka. Sometimes I did my French homework, and sometimes I just read 2000 AD and listened to Nine Inch Nails albums, because who the fuck wants to do French homework? Permissiveness is not necessarily always a good. I think we've gotten this fear of any kind of like hierarchy. No, you must not. We've just associated it blindly with tyranny, blindly with fascism. I'm so lucky. I now realize that was my adolescence. One of my geography teachers, well, no, I won't tell that story, but I was raised by men who knew violence, real world. One of my geography teachers fought in the Rhodesian War. He was a very, very strict man. It didn't harm me. The opposite. They were awful to us, but we were mates. You know, it was like, fuck the teachers. So we had a cohesive bond. You know, we'd give them like horrible nicknames and take the piss out of them, but we were together. Last thought on this. I was thinking yesterday about what in my life has shown me situations where you beat racism, when there was racism with people. You put the group of people together and you give them a common enemy. So I would work nightclub security and there'd be racially mixed doors. There's no racism on a racially mixed door of, say, 10 men, because our enemy is the public, is the drunk, violent public. There's no race. Well, they say that there's no atheism in a foxhole. There's very little racism in a foxhole. Like, this guy, I don't care what color he is, as long as if that guy is trying to beat me up, he stops him. This is all hierarchy and boundary and le nom du père. Thank you for listening to my TED Talk.
Well, no, but that links directly. I just noticed Darren in the comments said, are we ever truly safe from the id or monsters? And my point would be no, because it's part of the human condition. But for all the reasons you've just described, literature and art are almost like the 10 bouncers you're describing. They provide a way of conceiving of the common enemy. So the Greek myths are about how do you deal with the bubbling id that's under all of us? How do we as a society, the Homeric epics about the loyalty of soldiers to each other, whether it's religion, whether it's the Internationale, however, whether you're atheist or Christian, it's about this building of a community, exactly the way you're describing. So then you don't feel like you're psychologically alone. You can combat the id and the monsters.
Yes.
The way you described it earlier on, we're living in a society, and this hopefully answers Darren's point directly. What we're dealing with is a refusal to admit there are monsters. It's a refusal to confront the id. The id can have everything it ever wanted. And my point was that doesn't create psychological safety. If you pretend the id isn't there, it will, the return of the repressed, it will come back and bite you in the backside.
Yes, that's Jung's point with the id and with the shadow. That which we disavow, if we keep disavowing it and we just never look at it, it will eventually possess us, and then you end up with mass shadow possession, which is always going to be a form of projection. And as to your running theme, ultimately it's going to require a scapegoat. Somebody's going to have to get it.
Well, it's also interesting. I think I'm right in saying that the Metamorphosis became incredibly popular during lockdown.
Oh,
because people identified with it. And it interests me that in the middle of that ridiculous pandemic, the idea that that's what people actually lent into.
That's interesting. That's very interesting.
Whereas if I said with a straight face, they should teach Metamorphosis in high school. Oh no, you can't teach Johnny that because that's too upsetting. And it's like, well, and guess what? That was the generation that had no mental resilience to survive the pandemic.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, we were taught, I don't know if they still do, teach 1984 in school, and that has scenes of torture in it, and it's pretty awful. Pretty. Yes, I think, and I think I don't like this idea that children can't handle it. They go, oh, they can't handle it. They can't handle it. I'm like, the kids are pretty tough. Humans are pretty tough. It should be age appropriate. We should be careful. But I think we can assume resilience. And in assuming that resilience, we are implying I'm the adult in the room and I'm telling you you're strong enough to deal with this. Oh, well, apparently we're strong enough to deal with this. There's your responsibility. Go on, get on with it. Then I was encouraged to identify with discipline and resilience. Nobody said it to me. Nobody said, oh, you're a good lad, you're well disciplined, you're resilient. It was do as you're fucking told or else. But implicit within that was, this is what we expect you to do. You're not going to be thanked for it. It's just the base. That's why I say I think I'm really privileged, really privileged but I only say it now, like fucking 27 years later.
But also to contribute to this idea, you know, this construction of the common enemy and the culture that helps construct that. When Gregor in the story loses his voice, so he can't communicate, right back in Ovid's Metamorphoses. Sorry, I always say Ovid's Metamorphoses. There's the story, yeah. There's the story of Actaeon. He's the hunter who sees the goddess Diana bathing in a stream naked, and he accidentally sees her. So she turns him into a stag, and he's killed by his own hounds. And in the story, the hounds are named individually, whereas he's become a stag. He's lost his identity. And then I think Ovid at one point says, I can't keep naming these hounds. This is getting boring. But when he runs away, Actaeon, as a stag. And initially, it's a bit like Gregor in bed. He enjoys the feeling because suddenly he's the fastest he's ever been. And he sees his reflection. He sees his antlers in a stream and then realizes he's become something else, alien, uncanny. And then when he's torn apart by the hounds, the final line of the story is along the lines of, he screamed, it was a sound not human nor animal either. I'm paraphrasing badly, but it was this horrible scream that had elements of the human, but it's what distinguishes us from the animals. And this is what Kafka also wrote a short story about, Josephine the singer, who's a little mouse, and she does this ridiculous squeaking, and it brings the people together. So that the ambivalence, the ambiguity in that story is, we don't even know whether this stupid bloody mouse is a good singer, because that's not the important thing. Yeah. She's a little, to human ears, it might be this ridiculous squeaking. And I think Kafka in that particular story was referring to when he was taken to the synagogue, he'd hear the Hebrew being spoken. And at one level, it's nonsense noises with men dressed up in weird robes, like going to a Latin mass. But on the other hand, it's the thing that brings people together. It's the act of communication, the human voice. In most of Kafka's stories, it's when people lose their voice, terrible things happen. And I go back to, that's what it's happening now. People are losing their voice and overcompensating with these ridiculous identity fixations because they've lost their human voice and they can't communicate, they can't discuss. It's these ideologically riven bipartisan enemies. And we go back to your point about, you know, you need a common enemy, but ideally the common enemy isn't someone close to you. You need to find ways to create an enemy or something to be feared that's external, but also ideally transcendent. So in religion, the concept of Satan is incredibly useful, because unless you then say, I see Satan in you, and go and beat someone up, generally the whole point is you're sublimating the notion of evil out of social situations and trying to inculcate in people good behavior to each other. Now, whether it's religion, whether it's Marxism, it really doesn't matter to me. I'm just trying to identify the processes, and those processes are underwritten with ways of thinking, and those ways of thinking are nurtured by literature and art. So why I keep, it's like one of those building towers that kids play with. When you take some of the base bricks away, the whole thing's come tumbling down, because people don't have this formative ability to think in metaphors. Ian McGilchrist is an obvious example of this that I've mentioned to you in the past. He looks at it from a cognitive science point of view. When you lose the left, is the right-hand side of your brain does the metaphorical thinking. And the brain is bicameral. The brain is split into two sections. and they're supposed to work together. The sum, the whole is greater than the sum of the individual parts. But all we're concentrating on is left brain, numerical, scientific, literal ways of thinking, ideological ways of thinking that have a preordained plan, a structure, all these clear cut. And the one thing I absolutely adore about Kafka is every time you read him, there's a new ambiguity. It gets more difficult, not less. And that is against the spirit of our times.
You've given me a new way of thinking about a problem there with what you just said. So sometimes when I'm having an argument with somebody or there's a misunderstanding, especially in the online spaces, it's very predictable and it's robotic. And I've been thinking, this is an IQ issue. People are just, their IQ levels are just dropping or something. And actually, another option for thinking about it is their IQ could be fine. They're just left brain possessed. So I'll give you an example. And I'm in an interview with my friend Mohammed, and we're discussing something that's slightly religious, but it's got psychological overtones. And I'm talking about a narcissistic psychopath. And then without announcing to the audience that I'm now using the psychopath's voice, I start saying to my friend Mohammed, who's he's a Muslim, he's a religious man. I start saying to him, where is God in this world? Look at this world. Where is God? Where is your God now? I'm not speaking as Richard Grannon. I'm speaking as the psychopath I just referenced 20 seconds before. And people were going nuts in the fucking comments. They were like, no, that's Richard. And I'm like, are we losing? It's a rhetorical device. For that moment, I'm being the person I'm describing. Sorry, I didn't say, now I'm talking as this person who doesn't believe in God. I didn't say that because I assumed people would get it, and they didn't. They didn't. And they were really angry with me because they thought I was saying, where is your God now? I'm taunting people of faith, which I would never do. I would encourage people to have faith. I'd encourage people to believe in God. And that good faith element seems to have also been taken out of things. Everything is read as an attack first, and then maybe they'll accept that you're not attacking them. I don't know what you think about that literalism of not understanding a rhetorical device.
Yeah, and part of it is, I think everyone might as well start winding things up. I think, because I'm not about you, I'm knackered. But the role of language, my constant theme that must bore people, especially you, to death is that we're losing literacy. But one of the consequences of that is Kafka's writing at a time when Proust was writing, Thomas Mann was writing, Robert Musil, Der Mann ohne Eigenschaften, The Man Without Qualities, which is a great title to describe what's going on. James Joyce was writing. But a common theme amongst all these brilliant writers was the way in which literature was breaking down, or the use of language was breaking down. And there's a brilliant short story. I've forgotten the date of it, but it's there's a guy called Hugo von Hofmannsthal, and it's called The Chandos Letter. And it's basically made up, which people struggle with from the get-go. But it's a fictitious Lord Chandos writes to the philosopher Francis Bacon and explains his trouble with using language. He basically says in this letter, it's not very long, but it's really cleverly written. He's expressing how difficult he finds it to express himself anymore. And he's beginning to identify a problem that's rife in society. But he gives some amazing examples. So this fictitious Lord Chandos says, I was out riding and he was by some ploughed fields in the countryside. And that's important because when the fields are ploughed, everything looks the same. So they've recently been tilled. So if you can imagine the scene, you're in the countryside, there's just toiled the soil as far as the eye can see. And he says the only thing around was a quail nest, so some quail fly off. So he's left in his own thoughts. There's no stimulation from his environment. And he says the beautiful phrase, he talks about monstrous empathy fills him, which I think is a great description of what's wrong today. People have this monstrous empathy that's struggling to find a target. And he gives this example. He just felt overwhelmed. So before he'd left to go on this ride, he'd put some rat poison down in his basement. And he said, normally I'd ride off and not think twice. But he said, because I'm getting overwhelmed by feelings and I'm losing my ability to use language, I suddenly started thinking. I heard these screams from dying rats. I imagined these rats fighting each other to get to a hole to escape the poison. And he describes it in such vivid detail. And I go back to, he describes it as monstrous empathy. And I think that's what undergirds our society. There's this monstrous empathy looking for a target, and it's turned rancid. So all the people who preach tolerance and diversity tend to be the people who are least tolerant and least diverse in their opinions. But I'd argue it goes back to this Hugo von Hofmannsthal. He's writing about what happens when language breaks down. You become connected to the world around you in a very immediate sense, which can be interpreted. Great artists make use of that. But if you haven't got the ability to process that monstrous empathy, it comes out in pathological symptoms.
When we were talking last time about interiority, the psychological or psychoanalytic counterbalance to the notion of interiority would be boundaries and filters. So if there's no way of processing because you haven't developed boundaries, you haven't developed filters, there's no philosophy to life, to the self, to reality. Again, it's that boundaryless, permissive, tilled field, just a blank space. And if there's nothing, everything needs structure. Everything needs structure. Even sex, like libidinous energy, it's one of the things Zizek talks about a lot. Does the Matrix, he references the Matrix and he says, does the Matrix need the life force of humans? But what if the opposite were true? The life force of humans needs the Matrix. You can't just have direct sexual energy. There must be a channel, a story, a narrative, a way for it to flow, or you have a mess. And probably that boundaryless, a structureless, interiority-less space is a fertile breeding ground for monstrous empathy.
Yeah, there's one. My favorite quote of all time is Karl Kraus. He said, "The most miserable creature on earth is the shoe fetishist who has to settle for the whole woman." Just to back up your point about the importance of structured fetishism.
Yes. Did we sell people on the idea of reading Kafka, do you think?
We probably scared the bejesus out of them. But what can I just flag up? I'm going to do a video on the Judgment because I did ask people on my channel to read it, so I feel obliged. Yeah. I've also managed to split the Metamorphosis, the text of it, not all of it, but I'd guess about 75%, 80% of it into 2 videos, and I've interspersed it with German expressionist art. So that's a real crowd pleaser. Miserable visual art. Miserable text of Metamorphosis, but we've spoken quite widely as is inevitable in a chat, so I just thought people may or may not appreciate me diving deep down into the text. So that's, yeah, because I've already done a talk on the letter to his father. I'll do one on the Judgment. I'll do 2 on Metamorphosis, and then I'll talk to you later about potential future things, maybe not next month but soon, Brothers Karamazov. But there's also, have you ever heard of the short story, The Sandman?
No.
I think it'd be right up your street. It's by a guy called E.T.A. Hoffman. And it's a Freud wrote about the story. It's about the myth of the Sandman who steals children's eyes. He throws sands in their eyes if they refuse to sleep, and then takes their eyes. And there's a nest of his children in the moon that he feeds the eyes to these bird-like children. It's horrible.
I love it. I cannot wait to read it.
But it builds upon what we've been talking today, the notion of the uncanny.
No, and anything that you recommend me now, I'm gonna read, because I didn't read the whole René Girard book about Job, but I need him in my life. Because I started looking at the concepts that he's talking about, like mimetic desire, and I was like, I really need this. It's going to help me think. It's going to help me do my work. You know, it's
no the
so yes.
mimetic. I call it the Toblerone theory of desire, because there's he calls it the model, the object, and then there's you, and it's this tripartite relationship that creates desire. We only desire things that other people desire, is his basic argument. At one level, it's incredibly simple. His scapegoating argument is incredibly simple, but you'll have seen just the snippet you've read from the Job book. The minute he begins to analyze it, it is so rich. It's brilliant.
Yeah, it's really, really good. So yeah,
right.
There is somebody sent you a tenner. You should probably read that out.
Oh, sorry, brilliant. I missed that. If I can, this is how inept I am. I can't go up. Oh wait, no, I've gone too far. This is hilarious. Paul's techno idiocy. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Ironically, Mr. Sandman.
Yeah, ironically, Mr. Sandman. Yeah.
You ruined my question by talking when typing. It was sorry about that. It was about the Freudian concept of deep problems emerging from an inability to rest. An inability to rest. So I'm guessing that's about frenetic activity.
Yeah, I think he's saying the solution, the solving of problems comes from being bored and resting and, you know, taking time. We're in a hyperactivated, McGilchrist's concept, left brain dominant world. And then we never get the time to sleep, dream, hallucinate, you know, the quiet yin space where everything gets reformatted and put together. It's probably that.
No, I agree, and this is why I'd be really interested, and I'd like to know, Mr. Sandman, where you got your name. Was it from the ETA Hoffman story? But the fact that Freud used literature, so he wanted to illustrate what does the uncanny mean. He references the Sandman story specifically to explain what the uncanny means, and that these so-called useless artists who don't do anything practical. It's this point about when you rest and when you do what Kafka did. He wasn't a particularly good member of society, but it allowed him to actually see the underlying aspects of a society in ways that the rest of us can't.
Yeah. 100%.
Right. So we'll call it a day on that. I'd like to thank everyone in the chat, especially Mr. Sandman. I don't get much money sent to me, so I now feel suitably what's the word? I feel like an intellectual escort.
Yeah. Intellectual OnlyFans. Thanks for the tenner, Mr. Sandman. Here's a flash of René Girard.
I was going to say, could you think of a less appealing escort if I rocked up at someone's house? Hello.
I've come to read you a book, my love.
I've just put myself off my dinner. Well, on that less than edifying note, until the next time, everybody, all the best. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.